Hello learners. Topic for today's discussion is role of other stakeholders in policy making, political parties, mass media and interest groups. Part 2. We shall discuss this topic under following heads: introduction, meaning, common characteristics and the importance of interest groups, types of interest groups, factors shaping interest group system, interest groups and public policy, role of interest groups in influencing policy issues, method of operation, interest groups and policy making in India. Conclusion. Introduction. Public opinion expressed by individual citizens do not reflect the intensity of view. It does not in the main serve as the basis for a change in policy. Many citizens lack the required expertise in both the subject matter and the procedure of policy making. Acting alone, the individual citizen is rarely a significant force. On the other hand, group action is considered a more effective method than individual action for ordinary citizen to influence the public policies. Unless large number of citizens are organized for some common purpose or interests, the chances of transmitting their messages and policy issues will become bleak. For individual, the interest group is an important channel of communication. The interest or pressure groups are important means of enhancing the effect of public opinion. The exercise of political influence by organized citizens is a predominant feature of the democratic form of government. Students, normally an individual alone is not in a position to exercise any meaningful influence on the functionaries of political party for making a public policy or a policy suitable to his interest. Hence, for the protection of their interest and for the upliftment of their common interest, it is necessary that individuals organize themselves in the groups for exercising influence over the policy making agencies. Individuals join hand and form interest groups for exercising influence over the policy making agencies. Students in society, individuals join hand together quite easily when they have common self interest. In groups, they are more effectively able to communicate their views to the public policy making agencies in the government. Meaning. By an interest group, we mean an organized aggregate which seeks to influence the context of governmental decisions without attempting to place its members in formal governmental capacities. They are a collection of people or organizations that unite to advance their desired political outcomes in government and society. Interest groups are often used as pressure groups. They are organizations with formal structures whose members share a common interest. They strive to influence the decisions of the government without attempting to occupy political offices. They serve as a link between individual citizens and policy makers. They help in communicating their hopes to public officials by offering personal and expertise in the substantive matters and the procedures of policy making. To policy makers, the interest groups offer expertise, support as well as the intensity of view of large numbers of citizens with some common interest. In return, the interest groups are able to create areas of influence on citizens as well as policy makers. Students, interest groups, also known by various other names such as special interest groups, advocacy groups or pressure groups, are organizations which are combined by the individuals. They are usually formed in which members share common concerns, views, faiths, beliefs, and they attempt to influence the public policy in their favor. All interest groups share a desire to affect government policy to benefit themselves or their causes. Their goal could be a policy exclusively benefiting themselves or a segment of society. For example, we have many agricultural or farmers associations or organizations who bargain with the government for various subsidies for the agricultural products. Then we have broader public purpose organizations like organizations for environment protection, improving the quality of air, etc. Now students, these interest or pressure groups, they do not field candidates in the elections or run or contest elections. What that is, they do not seek to win or control or operate the government themselves, but basically and primarily they are concerned with the influencing the public policy making. That is why they have been termed as legislatures behind legislatures. We see that interest groups are important in all democratic societies and they are the protector of individual interest in a community. Common characteristics and the importance of interest groups. Interest groups usually develop to promote programs and disseminate information to enhance the professional, business, social or advocational interest of their members. When interest groups become enmeshed in the political sphere, they have one overriding goal: to gain favorable outcomes from the public policy decisions. Interest groups perform important functions. These include aggregating and representing the interest of groups of individuals in such a way that a single individual would not be able to do, helping to facilitate government by providing policymakers with information that is essential to making laws and educating their members on various issues. Now students, interest groups are primarily concerned with influencing the formulation of public policies directly or indirectly that affect their interest. They provide expertise, technical and political support to the policy makers and serve as a link between the individual citizens and the policy making agencies. They educate the people and influence public opinion on various issues concerning the special interest of their groups. Types of pressure groups. Interest groups in all types of political systems can be broadly placed under the following heads: economic interest groups, cause groups, public interest groups, private and public institutional interest groups, non-associational groups, research groups. Students, there are various types of interest groups and they exist in all political systems, whether democratic or dictatorial. We can classify interest groups under following heads. First of all, we have economic groups. Now, economic groups are omnipresent and ubiquitous groups. We see that they are present in almost all the countries of the world, and they are thousands in number. They have offices in almost all the national capitals around the world. Now, there are different kinds of economic groups. For example, we have business groups, that is chambers of commerce. Then we have some farm groups, that is groups concerning the agriculture. For example, Bharatiya Kisan Union. Then we have various professional groups of doctors, lawyers, teachers, etc. Then you have cause groups. Next students, we have cause interest groups who work for the promotion of certain cause. They are a sort of a promotional groups. They represent a particular segment in the society and they are basically non-economic groups. They are usually focused on promoting a particular cause or a value. For example, prevention of cruelty to the children, for example, ethical treatment to animals. Then we have public interest groups. They promote issue of general public concern. For example, interest groups regarding concerning the protection of environment, human rights, consumer rights. They have national as well as international presence. For example, Amnesty International, then international campaign to ban landmines, etc. Then you have private, public, institutional interest groups. This is another important category of interest groups, and they are not the membership groups, but they are the private organizations and institutions and sometimes government aided or funded organizations as well. They are basically, or they include think tanks. For example, we have Brookings institutions in US, then we have Adam Smith institutions in UK, then we have Institute for Defence and Strategic Studies in India. They are public, private, institutional interest groups. Then you have non-associational groups. Now students, non-associational interest groups are spontaneous groups, that is, they are movements, protest movements for a particular cause, or they are formed in reaction to a particular policy or an event. For example, we can include Narmada Bachao Andolan in this. Then you have lastly research groups. Students, we have certain interest groups or pressure groups which are research based groups working on the projects for the benefit of certain deprived or needy sections of the community or society. For example, participatory research in Asia which works for the betterment of Dalit girls, tribal girls, Muslim girls, etc. Factors shaping interest group systems: level of social economic development within a society, the system of government in the country, a country's political culture, the location of political power in the political system, type of party or party coalition controlling the government. Students, there are various factors which condition the working or which shape the working of interest groups in a political system. First of all, the level of socio-economic development within a society, which is responsible for the working of a interest group in a particular political system. We see that modern, urban, institutional and economically prosperous societies have a large number of interest groups in comparison to the less affluent, poor, rural or agricultural societies. Then the system of government in the country also conditions the working of interest groups. Whatever is the system or nature of polity, whether totalitarian or dictatorial, we have interest groups are present. But we see that in democracy they are free to operate, but it is not the case in a dictatorial or authoritarian regime. Then students, country's political culture also conditions the nature of the interest groups. The shared values among the people, citizens affect the operating of the interest groups to a great extent. There are ideological underpinnings that determine the political culture of a country. For example, in the communist regime, they do not recognize the rights of the interest to organize themselves in the groups and are subject to the potential legal action by the governments. Then location of political power in the political system also shapes the interest groups in a particular political system. Students, in authoritarian regimes or dictatorial regimes, we see that power is concentrated in a single individual or a dictator or a small cadre of officials, whereas in democracy we see that power is largely diffused. So, it is also a factor shaping the interest group systems. Then students, lastly, type of party or party coalition controlling the power, controlling the government also conditions the working of the interest groups. For example, in a democracy, if a leftist government is in power or a left aided coalition is in power, then it is more likely that labor unions would have more influence on the public policies. Interest groups and public policy. The activities of interest groups form a chain of linkage between the public policy and environmental forces and vice versa. The socio-economic composition of a society is reflected through the structure of interest groups at work in the said environment. It goes without saying that interest groups have a close relationship with public policy. These groups exercise influence on the policy makers to formulate such policies from which they get maximum benefit. Interest groups are not political parties, they are living public behind the parties. These groups do not nurse the constituencies for competing at polls. Their principal concern is to influence the governmental process in order to ensure public policy making in keeping with their special interests. Students, in modern political system, interest groups occupy an important place. They exist in almost all the political systems and all the forms of representative democracies. No wonder, that is why they have been called the living public behind the political parties. The impact of pressure group on policy formulation is very great. Students, they help in forming a link between the people and government, of which the legislators and administrators can make use in securing information and facts. For example, we can say that in any democratic government, making the laws regarding the agriculture or farm, the government or public officials would definitely like to consult farm associations or organizations or interest groups before making the policy for the agriculture or for the farmers. Role of the interest groups in influencing policy issues. Firstly, the pressure groups have the expertise in relevant subject matter. They may provide the policy makers with much technical data for and against a specific issue and information about the possible consequences of a policy proposal. Legislators find the expertise and data provided by the interest groups attractive because of their limitations and disinclination to accept the executive's recommendations. The executive personnel also look to the pressure groups for the information and opinion on policy issues. Besides the legislative and executive branches, the judiciary also feels the influence of interest groups which hire attorneys to represent their members. Now, students, interest groups play a very important role in influencing the public policy making. First of all, we see that these interest or pressure groups, they have technical knowledge, they have expertise, they have data regarding the relevant subject matter on which they represent. They provide expertise and technical help to the public policy makers in forming a particular public policy favorable or suitable to their interests. For example, we see that various interest groups or associations are sometimes their members or their experts are invited by the government themselves to sit on various public boards, councils or committees, as they have relevant expertise, qualifications and proficiencies. For example, we see that members of Federation of Indian Chambers of commerce and industry are consulted by the public policy makers while drafting a new legislation on corporate investments or trademarks, etc. Secondly, the pressure groups have the funds and necessary resources for policy influence. They sometimes give or donate money to help re-elect the members of parliament or the state legislature who had supported them on a disputed bill. They sometimes sponsor candidates in elections also. Thirdly, the government has to rely on the pressure groups for the implementation of its policies. Many government programs would remain unimplemented without the cooperation of vested interests. Such interests can gain control in the formulation of a policy as a price of its successful implementation. Hence, every policy program has to be planned with the consent of those groups which they themselves have to implement. Interest groups have necessary funds and resources to influence the public policy. They sometimes sponsor the elections of the representatives themselves. They provide funds to contest the elections. They donate money to help to elect the people or the members of the parliament or state legislatures who support them. So, in this way we see that the interest groups play an important role through their resources. Students, thirdly, we see that various interest or pressure groups are responsible for the implementation of various public policies for which they are concerned. It is those pressure groups for which they have pressed the demands and government cannot do without them, because they help in the implementation of that particular public policy. So, hence every program has to be planned with the consent of those respective interest and pressure groups. Fourthly, the successful groups are precisely those which have got access to the different stages of policy making process. They are those which can influence the executive and its department at the formulation stage before a bill is drafted. Here it may be mentioned that sectional interest groups are more likely to be in a position to exert influence than the promotional groups and can exert pressure on ministers and public officials before the government has decided to legislate. Fifthly, the influence of interest groups also depends on their potential membership. The strength of interest groups is an important factor in the policy making process. The leaders of such groups usually belong to a higher socio-economic status than most of its members and are likely to place higher priority on the stated political objectives of the groups. Next, students, fourthly, the successful groups are those interest groups which have access to the various stages of the policy making process, that is, they actively participate in the various stages of policy making. So, they are involved in the policy making themselves, and here it is basically the sectional interest groups who are more likely in a position to exert influence on the policy making. Then you have the membership of the interest group is also an important factor in affecting the influencing the public policies. The strength of a particular interest group matters a lot, and we see that the leaders of all these groups belong to a high strata or a high socio-economic status, and they are in a position to influence the public policies to a great extent. Method of operation: various interest groups operate through the method of lobbying, electioneering and propagandizing to influence public opinion and government institution. Lobbying involves working to bring pressure to bear on policy makers to gain favorable policy outcomes. In order to accomplish their goals, interest groups developed a strategy or plan of action and execute it through specific tactics. Particular strategies developed and specific tactics used, however, vary widely both among and within political systems. There is one aspect of lobbying that is common in all systems, whether democratic or authoritarian. building close personal contacts between group representatives and public officials to foster trust and credibility and to persuade the government that it needs the group. Personal contacts between political elites within and outside of government are often the major tactics. Now students, there are various methods of operation or working of the interest and pressure groups on which they exercise the influence in the policy making. First of all, there is lobbying, a very old and a common method. Then electioneering, that is funding of the elections of members of parliament and state legislatures. Then propagandizing, that is propagating their cause and rallying the public opinion in favor of their cause. We see that lobbying is an old age technique for influencing the public policies. Lobbying means developing a close contact between the representatives of the interest groups and the public officials who are responsible for making policies. Interest groups and policy making in India. Interest groups occupy a place of significance in the process of policy making. These play an important role in every political setup. The evolution of India's political economy has mobilized various interest groups and led to complexities of connections between the mobilized groups and the mainstream political parties. The nature and dimension of electoral politics we have in India emphasize the need for both mobilization of funds and local votes by political parties for winning at the hastings. The support of the interest groups is very necessary in both the endeavours. Some of the interest groups such as chambers of commerce provide the bulk of finance for the major political parties, while groups like farmers association mobilize local electoral support for the parties. In return, these groups exert their role in public policy making. Interest groups play a very important role in Indian political scene. We see that various interest groups organize and mobilize their cause in India, and they work for their specific interest and are operating for getting their desired ends meet from the public authorities. Public policy making have been significantly influenced with emergence of new political elites in the rural areas in the wake of the agricultural growth in India. They have set up significant interest groups in various parts of the country. In recent years, the farmers association have become enormously powerful. They have been making efforts to come together for the purpose of making a greater impression on national politics. An equally powerful interest group comprises of the industrial capitalists. They have the capacity to influence public policy making to a great extent. The Federation of Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry has played a crucial role in the public policy making. Students, we see that in India, the industrialist capitalist interest groups also exist, as well as the farmers association or farmers interest groups also exist. Students, in the last 2 years, we have seen a major role played by the farmers interest group in the national political scene. In the year 2020-21, we have seen that Indian farmers have protested against the 3 farm bills that were passed by the Indian Parliament. They were termed as the anti-farm bills or anti-farm laws by the farmers, and they protested a lot against these bills. Farmers said that these farm bills would leave them on the mercy of the corporates, that is they will be dependent on the corporates. They demanded from the government for repealing these farm bills, and it was under the pressure of these interest and pressure groups, Bharatiya Kisan Union, Kisan Mahasabha and all, that the government repealed the farm bill and set up a committee on the minimum support price which was demanded by the farmers. Conclusion: the level of interest groups' influence in public policy making depends upon the level of their organization and mobilization. In a system of representative democracy which India has, the interest groups influence political process such as funding election expenses of the parties, mobilizing the support of the voters, etc. The more organized an interest group is, the more influential it is in the political process and so in the public policy making. An organized interest group can effectively articulate and press its demand in the policy process in government. In case of India's representative democracy, justice has not blossomed fully, and hence the major tendency of the public policy making is directed towards the claims of the dominant interest groups such as industrial, capitalist or the rich farmers. Students, we see that as long as the human beings engage in politics, interest groups will be a part of the political process. Moreover, interest group activity will increase in future owing to the expansion of the governmental functions and governmental activities, owing to the globalization, which will increase the international interest group activity in the world. The success of interest groups will depend upon the level of their organization and mobilization. The more an interest group is organized, the more it will be influential in public policy making. If it is more organized, it will be more effective in articulating and pressing its demands before the policy making authorities. So, students, today we have discussed the role of interest group in public policy making. We have discussed the meaning of interest group, what are the main characteristics of interest groups, various types of interest groups, factors that affect interest groups, role of interest groups in influencing policy issues, what are the methods of operation of interest groups and interest groups in policy making with regard to India.